Okay, hello everybody. I need you to pull out your Gloria Anzaldua essays. If that's going to take you a second, why don't you go ahead and pause this video, one of the benefits of doing things online. Pull that out because we're going to be talking about the claim type that I believe that essay falls under. So in class we've been talking about claim types. There have been proposal claims. This was when we talked about washing your hands, and that ended up being super useful, right? And then when we talked about definitional claims, we were talking about torture in class, but we were also talking about Gretchen McCulloch's essay on emoji and whether emoji were a language or not. And we were saying, do they qualify as a language, right? And then today we are going to be talking about what are called ethical claims. This is when we are trying to determine whether or not an action is ethical. Now, that is obviously going to apply that. I mean, that's going to have to do with your religion and your deeply held personal beliefs and so on. But when we're making an argument about ethical claims and we want those arguments to be a little bit more widespread than a group of people who have a certain religious understanding, we can do it based on consequences of the consequences of the thing we are trying to evaluate as ethical or not, right? So in this essay, we will be thinking about how to evaluate English as an official language. Aren't you guys glad you get to see me not spell things right? Again, you'll never be free of me. Okay, so if we are trying to evaluate English as an official language, the first thing you have to do is name the action, which we have just done, the official language idea, right? And the more specific the action, the better your essays are going to be. If you said something as broad as, like capital punishment, right? Then you're going to have to think about all of the different areas of crime and when capital punishment would be effective or when it would be appropriate and when it wouldn't be. And it might be more effective to think about capital punishment in cases of first-degree murder, right? Because that narrows it down and you can really think about the specific consequences. So we're going to think of English as an official language in the United States as our specific thing that we are evaluating. And then we are going to start listing the consequences of this action. And I'm just going to go with Gloria Anzaldua here, and here's where you can kind of use your essay to follow along, but I just went through and I highlighted some of the consequences that she suggests will happen if language was to be homogenized. She is not necessarily talking about this topic of making it an official language. She's almost working with the assumption that it already is an official language because of her experience on the playground and in her school system when teachers were telling her that she wasn't able to speak in Spanish and wasn't even able to speak with any kind of accent at all. So that leads us to consequence number one, which is that she said it gets rid of accents. That's one consequence of making English the official language. She suggests that it will be gender biased, and so there will be more punishment for women who speak a certain language rather than men. She says that it will kill a living language. She says that her language that exists on the border, which is this mixture of Spanish and English and different communities, is a living language. And by declaring something an official language, you might kill that living language to extend that metaphor. She talks about how it will allow for assimilating a distinct people. She says that we will be unable to talk freely. That's one consequence. She says that people may be able to use language differences against each other. So this is what we were talking about in class when we were having this discussion, which is that it will automatically create a kind of hierarchy of languages. And if you think of a language as being official, that might mean that that language is somehow more legitimate than another language. It will also erase existence of a people who have been essential to American life. She is not just talking about her people as an isolated group that want to preserve their own culture in ignorance of other cultures. She is talking about how languages mix and evolve, right? That's part of the living language concept. And so she's saying to stamp out her experience of language is to stamp out the contributions that her culture and her identity even has played in shaping American life, right? The other thing is that it erases an opportunity for dual identities. This is a huge part of her essay that we haven't discussed yet. At the end, she says that stubborn, persevering, impenetrable as stone, yet possessing a malleability that renders us unbreakable, we, the mestizas and mestizos, will remain. And that is really essential to what she's talking about here. She says that by creating differences between languages as one being sort of legitimate or official and another being kind of like, I guess the opposite, illegitimate, and she's mostly talking about it being like culturally specific and the people in charge of languages wanting to get rid of that specificity. She sees that as a huge loss because she says that that is making people have to live these dual lives. And she talks about being like Mexican American, right? And how when you hyphenate a term like that, you are suggesting that one is more important than the other. Here you can kind of see how that works. If American is kind of like the root of the word, right? The root of the identity, then Mexican becomes this adjective that is describing American, right? And we talked in class how we feel like we're American first, and that might be a positive consequence or a negative consequence. But basically, she's saying that if you make English the official language, it forces people to have this kind of dual understanding of themselves and to not, let's say, for integrated dual identities and to not be able to integrate those two things because they have to have their Spanish-speaking lives and their English-speaking lives, right? And that those two things kind of exist independently, especially when both of those languages are talking about what is proper in those languages. But what she is saying is that if you can kind of put those languages together into one identity. She says we are a synergy of two cultures with various degrees of Mexicanness or Anglo-ness. If you can kind of try to integrate those rather than having this struggle between the two as this like fractured identity within yourselves, then you can become what she calls malleable. But if you have English as an official language, then we would not be malleable anymore. We would not be able to adapt identities as thoroughly, right? She's talking about an assimilation not just of cultures together, but an assimilation inside her own head. She is very disturbed by the way that she has, it says, internalized the borderland conflict, because that has turned her whole identity into a conflict. But she thinks that by seeing herself as Chicana or Latina or whatever kind of like combination of cultures she can find, this means that she can kind of merge those identities together and she doesn't have to think of them as separate, right? Okay, so to go back to our list, we have now listed some consequences of English as the official language. And what we need to do now is label positive or negative, right? Consequences. And you can kind of do that yourself. This is where the argument comes in. I would say that more punishment for women, I hope we all see that as a potentially negative. We see here killing a living language. I would say that was negative. And again, you could do this on your own, assimilating a distinct people. Now that one's tricky, right? We talked in class about how assimilation has its positives and negatives, so maybe we can make it sort of a both. Unable to talk freely for me feels like a distinct negative. For me, I would like everyone to express themselves in whatever way possible, so I'm going to give that a negative. I don't want people using language against each other. I don't want to erase this. You know, but maybe down here when I say erases the opportunity for integrated dual identities, maybe here I want identity to remain dual. Maybe it can be helpful to have multiple identities that you can kind of switch between. I'm kind of doing this just as to play like devil's advocate. I don't necessarily agree with this. But let's say it's like a positive to do that. Let's say going back up here, it might be a positive to get rid of accents. Like if you can choose to speak in a different accent, maybe that's a positive. And then the fact that you would not be adaptable, that seems like a negative. Okay, just like that was just a sort of exercise. If I'm being honest, I agree with Anzaldua in almost everything, so I would say these were all negative, but just for the sake of like a demonstration here. So we've labeled them positive or negative. Fourth steps is to weigh the consequences. All right, so you think here, and ignore the fact that it's a positive or negative consequence. Right now, you are going to say, what is the worst thing on this list? What is the most important consequence on this list? So if I'm gonna go, I think it's this one. So I'm gonna erase that, and I'm gonna put it as my number one. Unable to talk freely. Like I said, I want everybody to be able to express themselves freely. Let's see, another big consequence of this, I think we want to do this one. I don't want a hierarchy of language necessarily. I don't see a purpose for that. Just for the sake of argument, let's say that get rid of accents is a really important one to us. And then let's say erase existence of a people who have been essential to American life is an important one for us. Okay, so we look here, and you do this for all the consequences, right? But you look here, and now you decide if the good outweighs the bad. All right, so if I'm doing this based on Anzaldua's consequences and sort of my own consequences here, I would say there is one positive consequence in declaring English the official language right here, right? But if I look here, my first two consequences are negative and my fourth. So ultimately, I would say no, the bad outweighs the good. And my essay then would be that it is not ethical, it is not right or moral to create English as the official language in the United States. Okay, I'm hoping that is clear for how you would then do ethical claims. You try to keep an open mind as you list all the consequences. You make sure that you weigh those consequences, which are going to be the most sort of upsetting to people or the most life-changing for people, right? You could think about it either positively or negatively. And then you make the match and you decide ultimately, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And that's how you can kind of make this pragmatic ethical argument.